Okay, questions for Two Way ANOVA. The Two Way ANOVA will allow us to answer the following research questions. 1, controlling for the species, is body mass significantly different between the two sexes? That's the first question we can ask. After controlling for species, we take that into account, kind of remove that variance and say, is body mass significantly different between the two sexes? It's a lot like the multiple linear regression in that way, where we say, after controlling for this variable, what's the effect of this other variable, right? We can consider both of them at the same time. That helps us to consider what were previously lurking variables that we couldn't take into account. Now we're absolutely able to account for them. Cool, right? Neat. We need to do that. So controlling for the sex, is body mass significantly different for at least one species, right? We have 3 species. When we run the analysis comparing the 3 species, we don't know if they're all different from each other or just one differs from the other. But the question is something different there? And then the third question we ask here is the relationship between species and body mass different between male and female penguins? And now this is interesting because this is testing the interaction between the two variables, between species and sex, and saying, are those effects different for one level of this variable than the other level of this variable? And that's the interaction. And that's why I want you to watch that video, because it explains more about the interaction. Read the chapter, it explains more about interactions, and pay attention to what we talk about here, because you'll see more about interaction. It's kind of a tricky thing. It's a new thing. We talked about it a little bit before. We're going to go into it more now. This is what I really want you to get out of this lab too. The first 2 relationships are referred to as main effects. That's what we've been studying before. While the third point is known as the interaction effect. The interaction effect, that crossing, does the level of one variable affect, change the response of the other variable, right? So you'll see, it'll make more sense when you look at the graphs, right? The main effects test whether at least one group is different from another one while controlling for the other independent variable. On the other hand, the interaction effect aims to test whether the relationship between 2 variables differs depending on the level of a third variable. Oh, I said it pretty well there, I think. In other words, if the effect of the first x variable changes depending on the value of the second x variable, then there is an interaction between the 2 x variables. This will be easier to understand by looking at the plots below. When performing a two-way ANOVA, testing the interaction effect is not mandatory. However, omitting an interaction effect may lead to erroneous conclusions if the interaction effect is present. So you really do need to look at it. Now our hypotheses. Hypotheses, again, are a little bit more complex as we get into these more complex analyses. So hypotheses for a two-way ANOVA. We have the following hypotheses test. 1, the main effect of sex on body mass, right? This is our hypothesis for that first main effect. Null hypothesis, mean body mass is equal between females and males. Alternative hypothesis, mean body mass is different between females and males, right? Equal, different. Not different, different, right? Main effect of species on body mass. Right now we're checking for that second categorical variable, that second factor of species. Our null hypothesis is that mean body mass is equal between all 3 species, and our alternative hypothesis is that mean body mass is different for at least one species. And the interaction between sex and species, this is the third hypothesis we have to state clearly, that we're testing the null hypothesis that there is no interaction between sex and species, meaning that the relationship between species and body mass is the same for females and males. You could also state this, that the relationship between sex and body mass is the same for all 3 species. You kind of flip it back and forth. Either way, we're testing both of them. And you want to state it depending on what you're mostly interested in as a researcher. Okay. The alternative hypothesis then is that there is an interaction between sex and species, meaning that the relationship between species and body mass is different for males than for females. Similarly, the relationship between sex and body mass depends on the species.